Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello, welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with Professor Todd Zywicki, welcoming him back to Liberty Law Talk, a frequent guest, to discuss recent calls for reforms to Senate, in particular into the Congress, and what might restore that body to more vigor and greater political institutional health. Todd Zywicki, a frequent guest on Liberty Law Talk. When last he was on, we discussed the cartel of higher education in conjunction with a book Todd had just written with Neal McCluskey. Todd is an expert in bankruptcy law and consumer credit, among other specialties. He's also an economist. He teaches, mentioned at the Scalia Law School. He's also a senior fellow of the Cato Institute. Todd, you are also a star, I noted, at the Social Science Research Network. You are in the top 10% of most downloaded scholars on the Social Science Research Network. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Nice to have your work sought after. So thinking about, Ben Sasse had this op-ed, Make the Senate Great Again. That was in the Wall Street Journal earlier in September. And he listed a number of reforms to make the Senate work better. Sasse himself, a scholar, PhD in history, I think from Yale. His first speech in the Senate was about the sort of underwhelming nature of Congress and its current operations. And he listed a number of reforms, some of which I thought were ho-hum, some seemed interesting. One, take cameras out of the Senate, out of committee hearings, abolish standing committees. I would actually argue the committee should be strengthened if you want to restore the vigor of the body. Pack the floor, meaning require attendance at debates so there's a full house. Live together in dorms. Cancel re-election. And also sunset all agencies and departments. Give them a year left to operate and force the Senate to begin making laws again. So he understands the administrative branch dynamic there. But then also, and you've written on this, several law review pieces and debates and shorter pieces, repeal the 17th Amendment would be key. And he makes the point that it would allow the states to reenter national debate as states again, and that would sort of diffuse maybe the ongoing just ideology that percolates through the Senate. So what do you make of any of those proposals? And then we'll also focus on the 17th Amendment.
Well, more generally, all of them raise the same question, Richard, which is, one of the things that Sasse is basically getting at with a lot of these things is that the process of electioneering has come to dominate the process of governing with respect to the Senate. And the great irony of that is that the original Senate was elected by state legislatures, and that was changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment that moved to direct election of senators. And I know we're going to talk about this in detail, but in many ways what Sasse is coming back to rests on that foundation, which is that the framers clearly had a design in mind for the Senate, which it would be fundamentally different from the House. If they hoped and thought it would be a body that would not be driven by electioneering. It would be driven by basically governing, which is that the House was seen as the place where politicians would posture and do the things the politicians do in order to get votes and scramble for votes, but that the Senate, due to its longer term and the manner in which it was elected, would be different. And a lot of these things he talks about, like cameras in the room, the way in which the committee system is used to basically deliver benefits to special interests, all those sorts of things, in many ways are byproducts of that same fundamental dynamic, which is the adoption of direct election of senators by the people in partisan elections is fundamentally incompatible, fundamentally contradicts the idea that the framers had in mind. And so I think for the Senate, and I think in many ways that's what all these things are, is a manifestation of that problem. And it's not clear, we'll talk about sort of what went awry and that sort of thing, but I think he's right with a lot of that. And in many ways he's trying to treat the symptoms of that and not just the causes.
Yeah, he also calls for extending the term to 12 years from 6 years and prohibiting any political fundraising while the Senate is in session. So I think that fits your analysis, more treating symptoms. Thinking here too, it seems to me that a fundamental problem as well, and James Buckley has a book on this, that he wants to amend the Constitution to prohibit the Congress from being able to just make sort of general grants to states, that it would have to be constitutionally tied appropriations that would have to be a part of the delegated powers. And so he seems like trying to limit effectively what they could do. Another way of going at this, thinking about the 17th Amendment. So you mentioned 1913, it was ratified, it provided for direct election of senators. What's the significance of that? I mean, many people, I think, would say, obviously there's a democratic point there, but why would you argue that remade the senatorial body?
Well, 1913 is in many ways the pivotal moment in American constitutional history, in sort of the dawning of the progressive era and everything we've seen since, which is two things happened in 1913, which was not just the ratification of the 17th Amendment, but also the ratification of the 16th Amendment, providing for the income tax. So in many ways, what we saw with those two back to back was that the 16th Amendment unleashed the taxing power of the government, and the 17th Amendment unleashed the spending power of the government, and in particular, the ability of the national government to easily provide, to take those new funds and redistribute them to special interest groups in particular. And so if you look at it from that lens, essentially at that point, the New Deal, which comes along obviously 25 or so years later, is kind of a mop-up operation. Once you basically set that structure in place for a more robust national government in terms of taxing and spending power. So, we could go, and I think we will go into detail about the specific impact of the 17th Amendment, but what I think is significant and relates to Judge Buckley's comments that you noted was that when it comes to federalism, specifically, the framers saw the election of senators by state legislatures as essentially both the necessary and sufficient condition for preserving constitutional federalism. And the magic expression here is Federalist 51, which is where everything comes back to Federalist 51, which is Madison's view that in order to preserve the Constitution, the interests of the man must be aligned with the constitutional rights of the place. The interest of the man must be aligned with the constitutional rights of the place, which is to say that if you want federalism to be preserved as a constitutional value, the view of the framers was you have to make the self-interest, the political self-interest of the representative, be aligned with promoting that constitutional value. What senators care about is being senators. Yeah. And being a politician is a competitive business. And so what you have to do is basically make sure that if you're a senator, that you're responding to your constituents. And if your constituents are state legislatures, and state legislators, that's a very different constituency from the general public. And that's what the framers understood, and that's what the framers were trying to do, which to some extent was done imperfectly, because, as we all know, some kind of mechanisms of direct election arose during the 19th century. But I still think it had an impact, even with some of the mechanisms of direct election that arose. I think when I look at the historical record, it looked like a lot of these things that we talk about, unfunded mandates, and a lot of the real incursions of the federal government on the states just don't seem to be there, and I don't think they would be there to the same extent, even if the prior 17th Amendment Senate was an imperfect vessel for preserving federalism.
Auxiliary precautions in Federalist 51, that's a phrase that I think sticks with me as I think about problems in our current federal government. So the House, obviously 2 years directly tied to the people. The Senate was tied to state legislatures appointing the two senators to represent their state. And the auxiliary precaution, meaning two different bodies elect those two branches. And that being crucial because it's not just a majoritarian, two bodies representing majoritarian interest. Could you talk more about that? What was the significance there?
Yeah, and the framers, obviously it was kind of a genius structure, right? Which is two houses elected by different constituencies for different terms. We also have the president who is going to be indirectly elected. That didn't last very long. We still have the vestige of the electoral college, but we do not actually have electors. And then we had judges who would be basically appointed for life, right? And the idea was it was this machine in which these different selecting the members of the federal government by different mechanisms would bring certain incentives to what they were doing, and that the system as a whole would be more than just the individual pieces. If you look at the Senate specifically, there were two basic goals here, which is the first was kind of recreate a House of Lords, which is, as I mentioned, the idea was the House would be the place in which people did politics, retail politics. The qualifications were younger, the terms were shorter, and they expected that there would be direct accountability on the House. The Senate was obviously modeled to some extent after the House of Lords in Britain. And the idea was that the Senate would be the place for people who were accomplished in life. The qualifications are that they had to be older, 30 rather than 25. And the idea would be that the very distinguished people would be selected to serve in the Senate. Not only career politicians is what's ended up happening, but, accomplished lawyers, business people, military heroes, people of stature who were turned off by the idea of the House and all the electioneering of the House. And they would be chosen for sort of the character and judgment and prudence and that sort of thing, which is, I think, also one of the reasons why they gave to the Senate special responsibilities, like with respect to treaties and the like, that they didn't give to the House. That idea of the Senate as a House of Lords was to some extent true, because it did allow people like Daniel Webster to move in and out of the government. A lot of those people we know during the 19th century would kind of rotate in and out of the government, kind of returning when they were needed. Whereas one of the big things that's happened is now the Senate is basically just full of career politicians. And so, which has changed the dynamics, I think, of the Senate itself. The second important thing about the Senate that you allude to is the structural piece, which is we're supposed to do two things. One, preserve federalism, as we talked about a little bit. But the second was to bring this notion of bicameralism that you mentioned. And bicameralism is the idea of having two houses that are designed to pass laws in different ways so as to, as the framers clearly understood, mitigate the power of faction, what we would call special interest today. And the idea is that through bicameralism, interest groups would have more difficulty influencing the government, and the public interest would prevail by having two bodies elected by different groups. And that's one thing that's often forgotten when we talk about the original Senate, was the idea of bicameralism and the idea of having two bodies composed by different groups of constituents was designed to limit the power of interest groups. And now, when you make the two bodies more or less identical, it eliminates some of those breaks and some of those checks on interest group factionalism, as Madison called it.
Now, I know, just thinking through all of this right now, I mean, it's been a part of center-right conservative thinking in this country, that sort of and it's now at a fever pitch, sort of anger at elites or distrust of elites. Thinking about the system where state legislatures would appoint people to represent their state in the original design, could that also lead, though, to a system of elites bargaining with elites and distributing spoils, as opposed to, say, a more popular check that we currently have? I mean, I guess I'm sort of thinking, like, how would it work now that the ideology has really switched? Of course, progressive thinking has switched, where states now very much want to be a part of receiving rents from the federal government. I think I would say most states, 20% of what they receive from the federal government probably equals 20% of their annual budget, if not more. What do you think about that?
That's exactly the criticism that's been expressed, and it's not just from conservatives. Now, that was exactly the argument that was made beginning in the late 19th century, when people started beating the drums for direct election. The muckraking newspapers, the populist newspapers, deemed the Senate of the late 19th century and early 20th century the millionaires club. And of course, if you go back and read the Federalist Papers, the Senate was one of the things that the anti-federalists found most obnoxious for precisely this reason, was that what the framers saw as a feature, this sort of House of Lords, the anti-federalists saw as a bug, right? And they genuinely were concerned about this notion that the long terms and the lack of political accountability would make the Senate into this elite group. And again, if we go back to Federalist 51, what does Madison say is the challenge? If angels were to govern men, no government would be necessary. But if we've got men running the government, we have this trade-off. In the first place, the government must be powerful enough to control the governed. And in the second place, it must be obliged to control itself, which is there's this tension inherent in our Constitution between limiting the power of faction and limiting the power of democracy, which is the point about the government being able to control the governed, which is why they thought in terms of an indirect elected president, an indirect elected Senate for long terms, and of course, an independent judiciary that would be isolated or protected from the accountability of the democratic process and all that. But at the same time, the concern about elitism, which is to say that if you create independence to resist factionalism, you run the risk that the governors become the faction unto themselves and basically end up running the government for themselves. And of course, the exact same criticism you hear about the Senate is what conservatives say about the judiciary, which is that the unaccountable, unelected judiciary basically imposes their own views on society without any direct accountability. The framers' answer was that we want to have all of that, right? That's why they thought of all of those four groups, four different bodies interacting in some way that would bring different perspectives and that sort of thing. But you raise exactly the right point, which is this concern. It's a concern that was present. I have to say one funny story was a few years ago after I wrote my article in the National Review on the 17th Amendment, a blogger for the American Constitution Society said, well, Zywicki just hates democracy and he wants to get rid of democracy. And so I wrote back and I said, oh, so you're in favor of direct election of judges?
Yeah.
Well, and that was the end of the debate. He never responded, right? Which is the left, that it's the same logic, right? Either you're for election of judges or you're against it, right? But basically that's the argument the framers were putting on the table.
When I asked that question too, and I was thinking of Michael Grave's The Upside Down Constitution, and which is an interesting book for a number of reasons. One of which is the way he talks about competitive federalism, and as opposed to say the sharing of power, but the ways in which federalism is supposed to create this baseline, and the states have to compete against it, and that's been endlessly corrupted in the 20th century, where states now use the federal government as a way to prevent competition among themselves, but they haven't been completely successful yet. But Greve describes other systems. Argentina talks about the German system, whereby elites are able to use federalism to just endlessly divide spoils, and he says our system that hasn't happened in that way yet, because of this, the representational principle of the federal government that can actually touch individuals and represent individuals. And so I guess that's why I thought about that. And it seems what's ultimately being preserved by the U.S. Senate, and this is why progressives hate it as a body. Many times you'll hear this common refrain: why should Wyoming cancel California? There's 200,000 people in Wyoming, or something, and California has millions. And also California is just way more culturally important so far than Wyoming. But the point being, though, the Senate each state is still equal in the Senate. And to me, I would argue that's ultimately what matters. What do you say to that?
It does seem to matter, but whether it's what ultimately matters, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, that has some effect. And in many ways, that tradition lives on in terms of that decentralization effect. Let me say first, I think that Greve's book is pretty much the most brilliant book I've ever read on the Constitution.
It really is.
Most of us, by the time we reach 40, we rarely fundamentally change our minds about things. Greve's book fundamentally changed the way I think about the Constitution, from sort of a more pure states' rights view to a more interstate view, and sort of understanding the balance between the federal and state governments. And so I think it's really important. And what I will say is I think that the way in which the Senate originally operated throughout the 19th century was in many ways more consistent with Grieve's view, right? Which is to say that when you look at the history of the 19th century, what you see is, by and large, the federal government did what the federal government was supposed to do, and the state government did what the state government was supposed to do, which is the states provided most of the services as was expected, and the federal government did the things that were basically expected to do, which is they did interstate improvements, right, and made that possible to create networks, preserving the interstate common market. And in times of crisis, government would expand to pass a bankruptcy law, and need bankruptcy law to wage war where they needed war. But what would also happen is during the 19th century, we don't really see this ratchet effect that Robert Higgs points out, where the federal government would expand to meet a crisis that would then tend to retrench to back where it was. The first time we really see a ratchet effect in American history is after World War I. And maybe it was an ideological view, maybe it was inevitable, but I find it hard to believe that it was purely a coincidence that the ratchet effect first appears during World War I, and then during that exact same period of the teens and into the 20s, which is where we first start to see the first real expansion of the national government in terms of delivering rent-seeking type legislation and redistributing wealth to discrete groups within the government. And then, of course, that kind of blows the lid off as you move into the New Deal. So I think, and a lot of what the growth of the federal government has been since that period is primarily in wealth redistribution systems, right? Entitlements, subsidies, and rent-seeking type things, using the tax code as a vehicle for redistributing wealth, which may have just been inevitable because of technology and ideological change. But I think that changing the manner in which the Senate was composed created more of the conditions for this cartel federalism that Grieve talks about than was otherwise the case. Maybe it hasn't gone all the way for the reasons you talk about each state having equal representation. But I think it did increase the propensity for that to happen. The growth of the federal government, in particular, growth of the federal government in terms of providing rent-seeking or special interest type legislation.
When you look, and you know the history very well leading up to the ratification, and so the debates and everything that were going on. A question that I have, why would the states give up that power? That to me is an interesting question.
Yeah, that's always the interesting question. And there's some fascinating history here that my former colleague David Schleicher has gone into that is really made me rethink a lot of this, which is to say that I think that the way in which the structure of the Congress, Article 1, was originally designed with an indirectly elected Senate still has a lot of virtues and had a lot of virtues. But my enthusiasm for that particular mechanism has been tempered a bit over time by reading David's work, which is what David says is that during the 19th century, especially under the influence of Jackson, that earlier in American history than might be appreciated, parties basically overwhelmed the Madisonian structure. And we see that now, right? We see that in things like the farcical impeachment processes we've seen both of Trump and Clinton, which turned out to be partisan in their voting. I won't say they were equally partisan in their initiation, but that process and a lot of these processes, or we see during the Noel Canning case where the Democrats actually in the Senate actually endorsed the power of the president to basically declare them as being in recess, right? Which is you kind of reached the Madisonian nightmare of being overwhelmed in many ways by partisan political influences. And what Schleicher says is that happened during the 19th century more than I at least had necessarily appreciated, which is that parties overwhelmed the structural influences and that over time, the Senate elections placed a pretty strong influence over state legislative elections. The state legislative elections more and more became a proxy for Senate elections. So his argument is that to some extent, state legislatures may have been frustrated by the fact that these national elections, rather than being indirect, they basically became vehicles, right? Electors for their senator. And so I think that probably explains some of it, which is that this separation didn't necessarily work that well. I think some of it also that deals with the fact that interest groups, national interest groups, a lot of interest groups wanted the 17th Amendment. They wanted direct election. National interest groups, who wanted more regulation of interstate commerce in order to cartelize their industries, like, the railroads. Labor unions wanted it. Urban machines were strong proponents, ironically, right? Because people claim that the progressives are against urban machines, but urban machines in the cities wanted direct election because they knew that they could influence elections more, as opposed to having to go through state legislators, which were tilted before redistricting, favored rural interests before, Baker versus Carr in those cases. So I think it was probably a combination of interest group influences pushing for direct election to be able to influence the power of the federal government to give them rents, and perhaps some of this frustration that Schleicher points out among the state politicians at having their futures tied to some extent to senators who they didn't control, or they couldn't control their election very well.
Funny, I was thinking, you mentioned Baker versus Carr, I was thinking, even state legislatures, in a sense, kind of had a feature like the Senate in the sense of, rural interests were able to counterbalance large cities. So if you think about Illinois, if you walk into the Illinois legislature, the Chicago delegation must surely overwhelm everything that goes on there.
Yeah.
Maybe to the detriment of the state. I certainly noticed that when I worked in the state legislature, not in Illinois, before going to law school. Thinking here too, the Senate itself now there's two senators, and there's also a call now even to abolish the Senate. Not a call, but you see people make these or to change the its composition in some form, or to add states, and of course that gets back into partisan politics as well. I mean, at that point of the parties overwhelming the process is well taken, and it does make it seem as if separation of powers can't do its full work. Thinking about this question, the original role of the Senate and it being lost in the course of the 19th century, was there sort of more popular elections? How many states were actually holding popular, or at least allowing sort of a popular canvas to exist, and then the legislatures actually have to choose from that, or would commit to choose from that?
Yeah, by the time of the 17th Amendment, I think a majority of states had some degree of popular election, which is that they would either have candidates chosen in party primaries, and then the state legislature would choose their senators, or what they had was something called the Oregon Plan, which was a system in which people running for state legislatures could have a statement appear on the ballot, where they'd be required for a statement to appear on a ballot where they would say, yes, I will endorse the people's vote, or no, I will not endorse the people's vote. And essentially what they then would have would be what would be, legally a straw poll of voters, where they would not create a binding vote for one candidate or the other, but that they would create basically a non-binding vote that state legislators would agree to endorse. And I think some states may have just required the state legislatures to do that. One bogus criticism of the Senate prior to the 17th Amendment was the argument, which is that the facts are true, but the causal relationship is false, which is prior to the 17th Amendment, there were periods in which states had vacancies in the Senate, that they failed to select a senator, and this would often be the case in which the two legislatures of the state were controlled by different parties or by different factions, right? So think about during that period, the Western states, in which you had essentially a three-party system where you had populist Republicans as well as traditional Republicans and Democrats. And so it was the case that some states sometimes would fail to select a senator. I think that's that's largely a sideshow for two reasons, which is the first reason is that most states did that once or maybe twice and didn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So most states learned their lesson and they fixed the process. The more important reason, I think, was that there was a federal law passed I think it was in the 1860s, that required state legislators to select senators by a majority vote. They were not allowed to select by a plurality vote. And as we know now, a lot of Senate elections, the person who's chosen is selected by a plurality vote. Pretty much any time you have a robust third party, you have somebody selected who gets less than 50% of the vote. So that deadlocks problem could have been eliminated simply by eliminating that federal law. And so, that's something that's often criticized about the 17th Amendment, but which is beside the point.
The corruption point is made as well. I mean, and that seems interesting. You point that out in one of your pieces, or you make that point several times, that corruption was the allegation widespread in state legislatures over who would they pick potentially. But of course, you increase dramatically money in politics, political partisanship when you go to the direct elections. And I guess in a way, it's like with that, the corruption point blends into a progressive point, which was, this idea of getting a clean politics. And in the sense of, there is politics is politics, and wherever you try and eliminate it, it just goes somewhere else.
Yeah, that's right. This is one that, I laughed when you were saying it because I was just having a little kind of back and forth on Facebook the other day with a very prominent conservative person who was talking about, the corrupt Senate prior to the 17th Amendment, criticizing Sasse's view. And the great irony here is, well, first, corruption wasn't that common. There were certainly cases of corruption then. There are cases of corruption now. But you put your finger exactly on the point, Richard, which is it's kind of comical for somebody to say that they passed the 17th Amendment to get rid of special interest influence over the Senate, as if we don't have any special interest influence over the Senate nowadays when they have to raise tens of millions of dollars in order to run an election. And so I think that's kind of a sideshow, or sort of a unicorns and fairies approach to politics. To say that we've gotten rid of special interest influence in this fashion. We probably changed the types of interest groups. As I said, for example, the current system is probably made urban machines more powerful, or at least that made urban machines more powerful, but it also changes the composition of the interest groups that tend to be able to have economies of scale to lobby directly to the federal government, probably increase the influence of urban-oriented interest groups relative to rural interest groups for reasons we talked about earlier. But it's kind of silly, I think, to say the 17th Amendment eliminated special interest influence in government.
Yeah. Thinking here also just the notion, the progressive notion, this is a progressive amendment is another point made about this as well. The progressive ideology being, but of course, other progressive ideas didn't make it into the Constitution through amendment, like having referendums or recall or things like that. And that's a part of a lot of ways state constitutions now feature those devices. So we get the direct election of senators being a progressive advance, direct election, I guess, being the point overall they wanted to make there. Has that resulted, though, in better state representation? Or it seems, as we've been discussing, it's resulted into something like or ideology or party polarization in many ways.
That's why I take an interest in this, Richard. I think we're kidding ourselves, or I'm kidding myself, thinking that somehow or another we're going to actually repeal the 17th Amendment. Yeah. Democracy seems to be democracy, which is to say that once you give people the power, it's unlikely that they're going to give it back. But why I think that it's so useful to talk about and think about the 17th Amendment in the original Senate is for this reason of, and this is where I put my professor hat on, which is what I want people to think about and talk about is what is the Constitution, what should it look like, and what were they trying to accomplish? The framers, as Franklin famously said, created a republic if you can keep it. They did not create a democracy. They created a system where the purpose of government was to preserve individual liberty and to restrict the power of factions, meaning the power of organized interest groups to commandeer the power of the government, to enrich themselves at the expense of the general public. Those were the goals. It wasn't to create a democracy. And so I think the lesson we can learn from the history of the Senate and the history of the 17th Amendment is, why does structure matter? Mm-hmm. Why does it matter, the incentives we create for various political actors in this trade-off between independence and accountability to do their job? How does different aspects of the government fit together? And I think this kind of, in many ways, brings us back full circle to where we started with Ben Sasse's proposition in your point a moment ago, where we talk about people wanting to abolish the Senate. And I think what Sasse is really asking us to think about is, what is the Senate's value proposition? If all the Senate is a smaller number of people than the House of Representatives, but has the same degree of partisan conflict and sort of goofiness that we see in the House, why have a Senate? And I think what Sasse is basically saying to his fellow senators, as much as anybody, is, look, guys, our days are numbered. If we're going to basically just be like the House, then, our days are numbered. We're not proving our value here to the people. We're just a more elite version of the House. And I think what he's trying to push at with all these other reforms of making the body more deliberative, making the body less partisan, making the body less responsive to special interests, is I think what he's basically trying to say. Let's think about it, and maybe also then trying to increase the influence of the states. Is I think what his real point is let's think about, if we're going to have a Senate, what should its functions be? And maybe it doesn't involve just repealing the 17th Amendment. Maybe it's trying to bring back a lot of the virtues that the original Senate was trying to bring, which is to create a more deliberative, more insulated body that's more responsive to structural concerns of states, strengthen the process of bicameralism and the like. And I think that's maybe the bigger picture here, is what studying this and thinking about this history can tell us about constitutional structure and what is necessary to preserve individual liberty and restrict the power of interest groups and factions.
Just think about being a senator, and that your origination point is your state legislature, and could also be your ending point. And how would you act if that were true versus how do you act now? Are you this sort of hyper political animal who wants to not be shaped by the institution? To take Yuval Levin's arguments here, you're not going to be shaped by the institution. You're going to stand on top of the institution and use it to promote, your interest or your ideology or whatever your agenda might be. You're probably more likely to work within the system. I mean, I would think because you're appealing back to people who themselves have a certain stature in their states and are watching you.
It's a great point. And Vikram Amar wrote an article many years ago that's related to your point, Richard. And I alluded to this earlier, which is one of the big changes since the 17th Amendment is that the Senate has, in fact, become a body for career politicians, which is that prior to the 17th Amendment, where states, they couldn't recall senators, but it was quite common that there'd be more rotation in office. Senators might rotate through the executive branch or rotate in and out of the private sector over time, and that perspective has been lost. Right, the Senate now is a body of career politicians, and he documents this fact that there's less rotation in office, and there's something important in that. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it definitely changes what you do. I think if, as you said, maybe you go back to being a state politician after 2 terms, maybe you go back to being a private citizen after 2 terms, or maybe you rotate to the executive branch and then you go back to the Senate. That gives you another perspective, right? Where nowadays, as for example, we just learned in Alabama with former Senator and Attorney General Sessions, nowadays, basically, if you leave the Senate, there's a good chance you're done, right? If you join the executive branch, you're pretty much done at that point, and you're not likely to go back into elected politics, basically because some other incumbent will have taken your seat.
Yeah.
And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it's definitely a change from what the norm was during a period of indirect election.
And maybe we can end on this and sort of where we started in thinking about the composition of the government. If you think about, say, you had said the House of Lords, or maybe think in France, the 3 estates before the Revolution. They all had represented distinct groups within their countries. And of course, the problem in America is there is no elite, landed elite. There's no established interest in that capacity. There's no established church. So what are you in fact representing? That's sort of, I think, a question. And so when you're putting together the government, you've got to think about who it's representing, how it's representing them, what it's going to be, in addition to what it's going to be doing, how it's going to be limited. And that, answering that question, I think, is the House, the people, Senate, the states. The president is not going to be elected by a majority vote, but is supposed to, the original idea being a deliberation in the Electoral College. And those are the key points, it seems to me, that we've occluded or attempted to bury in this in the current arrangement.
I think that's right. And this is to suggest that the framers had the right idea, in my view, when they originally structured the Senate, which is what they understood that they were trying to do is create a body that would provide a bicameral check that would be slower moving, that would be less accountable to the people, and would be a vehicle for representing the states as states. And I think what we ended up learning during the 19th century was, even though that was the ends that they had in mind, the means that they chose were imperfect. And in particular, a general question that we all remember from our high school civics class, which is the framers did not count on the rise of parties and the way in which parties would change this whole dynamic, and in many ways change the dynamic involving the Senate. And so I think one of the lessons we can learn from this is, and when you look at the debates of the 17th Amendment, it's pretty clear at the time, in my view, they did not believe that they were essentially killing federalism. They essentially thought that federalism was so woven into the fabric of American life that they could tinker with this one system of accountability in the way in which senators were selected, and senators would keep on going the same way. And I think what they found out was that they forgot the lesson of the framers. And so I think one of the things I take away from this is I think the way the Senate was originally chosen turned out to be an imperfect vehicle for what the framers were trying to accomplish. But what that leads me to think is, well, if federalism is still a value, if bicameralism is still a value, what other changes should we have? Mm-hmm. So, for example, should the courts be more aggressive in enforcing federalism? And this is a point that Scalia, among others, basically said, was that the framers did not build in a lot of other ways of enforcing federalism because they assumed the Senate would protect federalism. But if we rip that means out, that notion of the Senate as a vehicle for protecting federalism for reasons unrelated to wanting to change the fundamental division of power between the federal and state governments, maybe this idea of the courts have largely deferred to the political process with respect to federalism, maybe we need to reconsider that as well, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we need to consider other types of proposals that people have talked about, like easier ways for states to be able to propose things to Congress, for example, or ways for states to overrule as a group incursions by the federal government. A lot of these sorts of things that were automatically done when states could elect their state legislatures, but now are not really vehicles for them to protect themselves within the overall structure.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for discussing your scholarship and thinking on the original intent of the Senate and now the 17th Amendment. Appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thanks for this stimulating discussion.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.